Rain needles across a deserted bus stop as a single dad kneels beside a trembling girl in a rain-soaked wheelchair. Her phone is dead, her eyes glazed, her breath thin. He wraps his jacket over her shoulders and checks the brakes, then notices a pale, crescent scar peeking from her collarbone. It looks hauntingly familiar, like a photo he once saw in a missing heiress report. When a black SUV prowls past twice, headlights lingering, he realizes this is not charity. It is a rescue. For both of them, the storm had arrived without warning, turning streets into rivers and bus routes into chaos. Henry Whitaker stood at the edge of the shelter, water streaming from his hood, boots already soaked through. He was late picking up Audrey from her art class, and the guilt sat heavy in his chest. But then he saw her, a young woman hunched in a wheelchair, shoulders shaking, phone clutched uselessly in trembling hands. The digital sign overhead blinked its cold verdict. Delayed. Flooding. Indefinite. Henry moved without thinking. He spoke the language of emergencies, kindness delivered brisk and certain. He knelt to her eye level, asked permission with a glance, then draped his jacket across her shoulders. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking wheelchair brakes by pressure, tire integrity by touch. The rims beaded with rainwater, slick but functional. She would not meet his eyes. Her breathing came shallow and fast, the kind of rhythm that said shock, not just cold. The bus was not coming. Henry knew that before the sign did. He offered his car, 2 blocks away, or the diner just beyond that. Lights still burning through the deluge. She hesitated. Her voice, when it came, was barely louder than the rain. No police. The words landed strange, urgent. Henry did not ask why. He simply nodded. That was when the SUV made its first pass. Black, slow, headlight sweeping the bus stop like a searchlight. Henry caught the details without trying. A visor pulled low. A cracked taillight on the passenger side. The partial plate. Smudged, but readable. The vehicle did not stop. It circled the block and came back. Slower this time. Lingering. Henry shifted his stance, placing himself between the wheelchair and the street. His hand rested on the chair's push handle. A gesture that said, "Not on my watch." She agreed to the diner. He pushed the chair with care, navigating puddles and broken pavement, feeling the weight distribution shift as she leaned slightly left to compensate for an old injury. When he adjusted the jacket at her collar to block the wind, the crescent scar caught the streetlight. Pale, raised slightly, precise in its curve. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a file opened. A news story. A face on a screen. But Henry kept moving. Questions could wait. Safety could not. The diner glowed like a ship in fog, neon bleeding pink and blue across wet glass. Inside, warmth hit them in a wave. Steam rose from coffee pots. The smell of frying onions and burnt toast. Henry guided the wheelchair to a booth near the kitchen exit, an instinct he did not name. She wrapped her hands around a mug of cocoa, fingers white at the knuckles, and for the first time, her shoulders dropped an inch. The television above the counter murmured local news. Storm coverage, road closures, a human interest piece about community resilience. Then the anchor's voice shifted. A 2-year anniversary segment. The missing heiress. Alexandra Sterling, daughter of philanthropist William Sterling, last seen leaving a charity gala. The screen filled with an archival photograph. A young woman in an elegant dress, smiling beside her father. But what stopped Henry's breath was the inset. A medical diagram. A pediatric surgical scar, crescent-shaped. Rare incision technique. Fewer than 10 cases in the region. Henry's gaze moved from the screen to the woman across from him. The jacket had slipped. The scar gleamed under the diner's fluorescent hum, matching the diagram with surgical precision. She had not noticed the television. She stared into her cocoa, lost or hiding. Henry could not tell which. He made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. He would not ask. Not here. Not now. But he would not let her go back into that rain alone. He paid cash. He thanked the cook and asked to use the kitchen exit. The chef, a man who had seen enough to know when not to ask, simply nodded and held the door. Henry texted Audrey. Late. Bolt the door. Secret knock. Their code. The one they had practiced since she was 6, since the night Henry's late wife had asked him to promise that their daughter would always know how to let the right people in and keep the wrong ones out. The SUV was idling across the street when they emerged. 2 figures inside, shapes only, silhouettes that did not move. Henry kept his body angled, blocking the line of sight. He pushed the wheelchair toward his car with deliberate calm, muscle memory from a decade of emergency calls, telling him that panic was contagious and composure was armor. His apartment sat above the auto shop where he worked, modest and warm, cluttered with the evidence of a life rebuilt one careful piece at a time. Audrey opened the door on the 3rd knock, eyes bright with curiosity and concern. Henry introduced their guest as someone who needed help tonight. No more, no less. Audrey, 9 years old and wiser than her age suggested, simply nodded and fetched the extra blanket from the hall closet. They set up the couch near the window. Henry asked before moving the wheelchair, before adjusting the pillows, before dimming the lights. The young woman, whose name he still did not know, watched him with something close to wonder, as if kindness without questions was a language she had forgotten. Audrey showed her the quick-release straps on the wheelchair footplates, a knot trick learned from camping trips with her dad. The woman smiled. It was small, fragile, but real. That night, after Audrey had gone to bed, the woman spoke into the darkness. Her voice was a thread pulled taut. She did not want police. She did not want hospitals. She wanted, more than anything, to disappear correctly this time. Henry sat in the armchair across from the couch, hands folded, listening the way he had been trained to listen in the back of ambulances, when people needed to be heard more than saved. He made one call before dawn, a quiet tip to Detective George Morales, a man Henry trusted in the cautious way one trusts a system that has failed before. He described the SUV, the cracked taillight, the slow passes. He did not mention the woman on his couch. George took the information without pressing, which was its own kind of grace. Henry hung up and checked his email. An old tip-line auto-forward sat in his inbox. A journalist named Vivian Brooks asking for witnesses in a case about shell clinics tied to corporate trials. Henry bookmarked it. He did not know yet how the pieces connected, but his instincts, honed through years of saving people one decision at a time, told him they would. Morning arrived soft and gray. Pancakes on the griddle. Audrey's chatter about knots and wheels, and whether the rain would hold off long enough for chalk drawings in the park. The woman ate slowly, as if the simple act of sitting at a table with people who asked nothing of her was a luxury she had forgotten how to trust. Henry watched the street from the kitchen window. The SUV made another pass at 8. He noted the time. Then she began to talk. Not all at once. In slivers. She had woken in a private clinic with no memory of how she arrived. They called her Annette Vale. They said her family had been notified. They said the accident had been severe, that she was lucky to be alive, that her old life was gone, and this was her fresh start. But she remembered fragments. Surgical lights, a voice repeating her new name like a lullaby. Hallways made of glass. And a nurse, older, kind, who had whispered late one night, "What you remember makes you valuable." Her real name, she said finally, was Alexandra. She did not know if anyone was still looking. Henry believed her, not because of the scar, though that was proof enough. He believed her because of the way she held herself, coiled tight, ready to vanish at the first wrong word. He had seen it before in trauma survivors, that hypervigilance that never quite faded. He told her she could stay as long as she needed. No police unless she said so. No questions she did not want to answer. But he would not let that SUV circle her again. She pulled a wristband from her backpack, faded and creased. The name printed in black ink. Annette Vale. Discharge date, from 18 months ago. The clinic's name, Vale Recovery, meant nothing to Henry, but he photographed it anyway. Evidence, he thought, though for what and for whom he could not yet say. 2 days later, the fixer arrived. His name was Crispin Hale, and he wore his polish like a uniform, expensive suit, calm voice, a briefcase that suggested solutions, not threats. He found Henry at the auto shop during lunch, when the hydraulic lifts hissed and the air smelled of oil and metal. Crispin introduced himself as a representative of Sterling Enterprises. He said there had been a misunderstanding. A young woman, vulnerable and confused, had been taken in by a well-meaning stranger. The family was grateful, but it was time for professionals to step in. Henry set down his wrench and met the man's gaze without flinching. He asked what the family wanted. Crispin smiled. A medical evaluation, a return to proper care, and, of course, a non-disclosure agreement, generously compensated. He named a figure that would have covered Audrey's college tuition twice over. Henry did not blink. He said he would think about it. Crispin left a card and a deadline. 48 hours. That evening, Henry told Alexandra what had happened. She went pale, then still, the kind of stillness that came before flight. She said Crispin had visited the clinic once, years ago, asking questions about trial participants. She said the men who had taken her were not family. They were fixers, cleaners, the kind who made problems disappear for people rich enough to afford erasure. Henry asked if she wanted to run. She shook her head. She wanted to fight, but she needed proof. They went to the library the next morning. Alexandra, Henry, and Audrey, who brought her homework and sat at a table drawing elaborate knot diagrams while the adults worked. Henry had learned, in his years as an EMT, that the best evidence was the kind you could measure. They started with the scar. Alexandra pulled up her shirt just enough. Henry, with her permission, photographed it. Close up, with a ruler for scale. In different lighting, they counted the stitch marks. 17, evenly spaced. The pattern matched the diagram from the news report with mathematical precision. Then they searched public records, birth announcements, hospital rosters, charity galas. Alexandra's face appeared again and again, always beside her father, William Sterling, a man whose foundation had built hospitals and funded research and put his name on buildings across the city. There were older photos, too. A child in a hospital bed, recovering from surgery. The caption mentioned a rare congenital defect, corrected at age 7 by a pioneering pediatric surgeon. The surgeon's name was listed. Dr. Vivian Reyes. Henry wrote it down. The crescent birthmark came next. Alexandra had mentioned it once, a small detail she thought insignificant. 3 moles on her right shoulder blade, forming a shallow arc. Henry photographed it. He uploaded the images to a cloud service, time-stamped and geotagged, because he knew that evidence without chain of custody was just a story. Audrey, watching from her homework, asked why they were taking so many pictures. Henry told her the truth. Because sometimes people need to prove who they are when the world tries to say they are someone else. They found the surgeon's contact information through the hospital's alumni directory. Henry drafted an email. Careful, respectful, asking if Dr. Reyes remembered a patient from 15 years ago. A girl with a crescent incision. A case that had gone well. He attached the photograph of the scar. He did not mention why he was asking. He simply said it was urgent. The reply came within an hour. Dr. Reyes remembered. She said the incision technique was highly specialized. She had performed it fewer than 10 times in her career. She remembered Alexandra Sterling, specifically because the girl's father had funded the research that made the surgery possible. She offered to provide an affidavit if needed. Henry exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. Proof. Real, documentable, incontrovertible proof. But proof, he learned quickly, was not safety. That night, the pressure escalated. Detective Morales called. His voice was tight, apologetic. An APB had been issued. Alexandra Sterling, missing person, possibly endangered. Last seen with an unidentified man. The description matched Henry. George said he did not believe it, but he could not ignore it. Henry had 24 hours to bring her in, or the department would come to him. Henry hung up and told Alexandra. She did not cry. She simply nodded, as if she had been expecting this. She said they would not stop. They would use the system against him, twist his decency into suspicion, turn his protection into kidnapping. She said she would leave tonight, disappear again, this time for good. Henry looked at Audrey, asleep on the couch with her knot diagrams spread across her lap, and made a choice. They would not run. They would not hide. They would bring the fight into the light. Vivian Brooks, the journalist, answered her phone on the second ring. Henry explained in short. Careful sentences. The scar. The clinic. The APB. The fixer. Vivian listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said 4 words. I've been waiting for this. She said the shell clinics were part of a larger network, tied to corporate drug trials that paid desperate people to become test subjects. Some of those people had families who could make noise. Others, like Alexandra, had families rich enough to make silence. Vivian said she had been gathering evidence for 2 years. She said if Henry could get Alexandra to a safe location, with the proof, she could break the story wide enough that no fixer could touch them. The church basement was Vivian's idea. Neutral ground, witnesses, a place with cameras, and a reverend who asked the right kinds of questions. They arrived after dark, Henry pushing the wheelchair through side doors, Audrey holding a folder of photographs and printed records like a talisman. Vivian was already there, along with George Morales, who had come off the clock and off the record. They spread the evidence across a folding table. The scar photos, the stitch count, the surgeon's affidavit, notarized and sealed, the birthmark constellation, the discharge wristband from Vail Recovery, the dashcam footage Henry had pulled from his car, showing the SUV's cracked taillight and partial plate. George studied the materials in silence. Then he made a call. Not to the station, to a judge he trusted. A woman who had presided over cases that required speed and discretion. He explained the situation. Identity erasure. Possible human trafficking. A corporate cover-up. Note, the judge listened. She said she would issue an emergency identification order, pending DNA confirmation. She said the APB would be suspended. She said to bring Alexandra Sterling to the courthouse in the morning, and to bring every scrap of proof they had. But the night was not over. At midnight, the lights in Henry's neighborhood went dark. A rolling blackout, the utility company said, affecting only a 6-block radius. Henry, standing at his apartment window, watched the auto shop below. A figure moved in the shadows. Then another. He smelled smoke. By the time he reached the ground floor, flames were licking up the side of the building, concentrated near the electrical panel. Arson, dressed as an accident. Henry grabbed the fire extinguisher and fought the blaze while Audrey called 911 from upstairs. The fire department arrived within minutes. The flames were contained. The damage was cosmetic, but the message was clear. They were running out of time. At dawn, they moved to the endgame. The courthouse garage, level 3, a location George had chosen for its cameras and contained space. Henry drove Alexandra. Vivian followed with Audrey and a camera operator. George waited with 2 uniformed officers he trusted. The plan was simple. Walk Alexandra in. Present the evidence. Let the judge make it official. Force the truth into a space too public to be erased. They parked. Henry helped Alexandra transfer to her wheelchair. Audrey checked the straps. Everything was ready. Then the SUV arrived. It blocked the exit ramp, engine idling. 2 men stepped out. One was Crispin Hale. The other was someone new. Older. Harder. His name, Vivian whispered, was Dermot Cross, venture executive, the man who gave the orders. Dermot walked toward them with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. He ignored George. He ignored Vivian. He spoke directly to Alexandra. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said the clinic had been acting in her best interest. He said the trials had been voluntary, the care exceptional, the outcomes beneficial. He said if she came with him now, quietly, the APB would disappear, Henry would face no charges, and everyone could move on. Alexandra, who had been silent for most of the night, lifted her head. She said her name. Loud. Clear. Not Annette Vale. Not the ghost they had tried to make her. Alexandra Sterling, daughter of William Sterling, survivor of an accident that was no accident. Subject of trials she had never consented to. And she was done disappearing. Dermot's expression did not change. He signaled to the driver. The man moved toward the wheelchair. That was when Henry stepped in front. George moved beside him. The uniformed officers closed ranks. Vivian's camera operator hit record, and from the stairwell, footsteps echoed. William Sterling emerged, flanked by his lawyer. He looked older than in the photographs. Grief and guilt etched deep, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady. He said his daughter's name. He said he had been looking for 2 years. He said he had trusted the wrong people, believed the lies that she had wanted privacy, that she was recovering in a private facility abroad, that silence was for her own good. He said he had not known about the clinic, the trials, the erasure. But he knew now, and he was taking her home. Dermot made one last move. He claimed there was no proof, that Alexandra was confused, that the scar was coincidence, that the affidavit was hearsay. George handed him the folder, the surgeon's statement, the stitch count analysis, the birthmark photos, the dash cam footage of the SUV that had been following her for days, and then the recording. Henry had worn a wire during Crispin's visit to the auto shop. Crispin's voice, offering money for silence. Dermot's name mentioned twice. The clinic's connection to Sterling Enterprises confirmed. The judge's order came through on speaker. DNA testing to be expedited. Alexandra Sterling's identity reinstated pending confirmation. Dermot Cross and Crispin Hale to be detained for questioning. The driver of the SUV, whose cracked taillight now sat in evidence lockup, was already in custody. The system, for once, moved faster than the money. Alexandra looked at her father. He knelt beside the wheelchair. He did not touch her without permission. He simply waited. She nodded. He took her hand. They cried. Not the dramatic sobs of a reunion scene, but the quiet, exhausted tears of people who had been lost and were finally found. Weeks later, after the DNA results came back matching, after the clinic was raided and its records seized, after the trials were exposed and the board members resigned, William Sterling stood in the conservatory of his home and made a promise. He would fund an oversight committee. He would endow a grant for emergency responders like Henry. He would ensure that every survivor of the clinic's trials had access to care and compensation. He would rebuild trust, not with words, but with action. Alexandra chose to stay with her father, but she visited Henry and Audrey often. She brought them to the conservatory, where filtered sunlight turned the glass walls into prisms. She told stories about the clinic, that she was finally ready to speak aloud. She attended physical therapy on her terms, focusing not on recovery and the way the clinic had defined it, but on strength and autonomy, and the simple joy of moving through the world as herself. Crispin Hale was offered a deal. Testify against Dermot Cross, and the charges would be reduced. He took it. He stood in court and spoke about the pressure, the belief that he was protecting a family's reputation. The moment he realized he had been protecting predators instead. It was not redemption, but it was a start. Dermot Cross received a sentence that reflected the scale of his crimes. The driver of the SUV, who had been following orders, cooperated with investigators and led them to others in the network. Vivian's story broke wide, but she centered the survivors. She protected the nurse, Irene, who had whispered the truth. She ensured that Alexandra's voice was the loudest in the room. The article won awards, but more importantly, it changed policy. Shell clinics across the state were investigated. Corporate trial oversight was strengthened, and people who had been disappeared began, slowly, to reappear. On a soft afternoon in spring, Alexandra met Henry and Audrey at the park near their apartment. The rain came down light and clean, washing the chalk drawings Audrey had made into rivers of color. Alexandra sat in her wheelchair, jacket draped over her shoulders, smiling as Audrey showed her a new knot design meant to secure a wheel in loose gravel. Henry stood beside them, hands in his pockets, watching the ordinary miracle of a life reclaimed one careful decision at a time. The jacket was the same one he had given her that first night at the bus stop. She had insisted on keeping it, not as a symbol of rescue, but as a reminder that the world was full of people who would try to erase you, but it was also full of people who would wrap you in warmth and ask nothing but the chance to help. That identity was not something given by the powerful. It was something you carried in the shape of a scar, the memory of a name, the refusal to vanish. They talked about small things. Audrey's upcoming school project, Henry's promotion at the shop, Alexandra's plans to audit classes at the university, studying something that mattered to her, not to anyone's expectations. The rain slowed. The sun broke through in shafts. And for the first time in years, the three of them simply sat together, watching chalk wheels bloom and blur on wet pavement, knowing that the fight was over, but the care would continue, on ordinary days, in ordinary ways, because that was how the best rescues worked. Not with sirens and spectacle, but with steady hands and the quiet insistence that every person deserves to be seen.